Okay, as far as Konami is concerned, I believe Konami's been around since 1969. And when video games start to, or the video game industry started to become hot from the mid 80s onwards, basically Konami seemingly did some of his best work in terms of producing enjoyable, memorable, high quality video games during the 90s and the early 2000s to some extent because we got games like Metal Gear Solid, which was a stealth classic. We had games like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which is an action platform, Metroidvania kind of game, and it's a classic as well. And you had, Silent Hill 2, which came out back in the early 2000s, I believe. I believe it was in 2000 or 2001. You had Contra 3 Alien Wars, which was definitely a game that stood out for the SNES back in the early 90s. And you had games like Gradius V, which came out back in '04. And despite the fact that the shoot 'em up genre of gaming, the 2D shoot 'em up genre of gaming was basically played out and there was really no interest in that anymore because people were interested in 3D gaming. Gradius V ended up being kind of like a hidden gem, mainly because it was a great game that looked like it belonged to the 90s, and it was one that is highly overrated and got overlooked by various other video games that got popular on the PS2, such as Grand Theft Auto, Vice City, and Final Fantasy, X, and all that stuff. Games that just overshadowed something like Gradius V were just up there in the early 2000s. You had Suikoden, which came out in 1995 for the PS1, and it had a very compelling story, nice graphics, and I believe it was followed up with Suikoden 2 in '98. Those were two, RPG classics that are underrated, and they were also overshadowed, but on the PS1. And you also had games such as Dance Dance Revolution, which came out in 1998, and that was featured in arcade centers. And I believe there was a PS1 port of Dance Dance Revolution as well. And just kind of like looking at that list, it does seem like Konami, the company, has done some of its best work within the 90s as far as video games are concerned. And maybe to some extent in the early 2000s, they may have had like, a couple of games. I believe I had mentioned just two, but yeah, it seemed like, Konami did its best work in the 90s. And it seemed like, from the early 2000s onward, we haven't really seen anything that was too popular or something that connected with people too well, or something that wasn't really memorable or anything like that. It seemed like people reminisce about, the older games that Konami make. And then in fact, I believe at one point I wrote whether or not, Konami made better games than Capcom did in the late 80s and the early 90s. And I guess it really depends on whether or not you're more of a Konami or a Capcom fan, because you look at the Konami games that came out in the 80s, you had Castlevania, 1 through 3, and then you had Castlevania Dracula X, which came out, I believe, back in the early 90s. And then I guess as far as like high profile, the most popular game that Konami's ever made as far as popularity is concerned was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4, Turtles in Time, and that was an arcade beat 'em up classic that came out back in, I believe it was 1991 if I'm not mistaken. It was sometime in the early 90s, and that was probably one of the best beat 'em up games ever made. Probably one of the best video games I played. You got to have 4 players at a time. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series was very popular, and it's something that is considered to be legendary, and it's something that people are quite fond of to this day, especially retro gamers who grew up in that era of just going to arcade centers. And I remember the SNES port of the game was very popular as well, despite the fact that it was only a 2-player game. But yeah, like Capcom had all kinds of games. You had in the early '90s, they had the Street Fighter 2 series, which ended up becoming legendary. They had games like Mega Man X, which came out in 1993. So, I mean, as far as popularity is concerned, I guess it felt like Konami and Capcom were kind of on the same level, but there's no doubt whatsoever that throughout the 90s decade that Konami did some of its best work. And depending on whether you're a fan of Konami or Capcom, you would agree that Konami in some areas, such as the beat 'em up genre, definitely was better than Capcom was in more ways than one.